See.
Okay, welcome everybody to this week's Rising Tide Foundation presentation, where I'm very happy that we are joined once again by our good friend Nancy Spannaus, who has graced us with many a wonderful presentation over the past months and years, pertaining to a lot of her work, a lot of her original discoveries of the nature of the real American system that has really given rise to everything good that we love when we think of the United States from its original days and even the century before that to the present. And if there's anything that is good, that is salvageable, that will allow for the survival of both the USA as well as humanity, it is going to be through the rediscovery of these principles of this American system and the associated culture that gave rise to this amazing science of economics that emerged out of the minds and the work of people like Benjamin Franklin, the followers of Colbert, the Cameralist school that Nancy has written so much about, as well as Alexander Hamilton and his followers through to the present day. So, Nancy has recently published a third book in her recent series of books. Um, One being the first of this new series being Hamilton versus Wall Street that came out back in, I think, 2020. Defeating Slavery of last year, and now most recently, the book that will be the topic of today's presentation on what is the difference between a subject and a citizen. It's a big question, and Nancy has brought all of her faculties together to and all of her work together on history to answer this in a way that I think will stimulate also a good conversation, which we'll do at the end of her formal presentation. And like usual, I ask people to put their names in the chat box. We've got about 90 minutes today, so I figure about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour, however long Nancy wishes to take for her main presentation, and then another 30 minutes or so for dialogue. So I'd ask people to keep their questions short and concise, and we'll move through this pretty well. So Nancy, thank you so much for taking the time, and I'm looking forward to learning as I always do from you. So it's all yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much for hosting me today. This has been a rough period for me because I'm battling cancer as well, so I haven't been able to beat the bushes and, get all the events that I generally need in order to get this book out and about. It's been out for almost 3 months. Um, and has had some very good response, but um, I'm very much looking for further circulation. And, while I was orienting to Americans, Canadians are certainly welcome. And perhaps some of you are Americans. I saw Bruce there, so I know he is. Um, so let me proceed. What I'm going to do, I am pushing for uh, wide circulation of this book. Okay, from subject to citizen, what Americans need to know about their revolution. And I wrote it as a challenge, and it starts off as follows. My book, From Subject to Citizen, was written as a challenge to my fellow Americans. 249 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That was the way Abraham Lincoln described the founding of the United States of America in his address at Gettysburg in November 1863. He concluded that Americans must devote themselves to ensure that, quote, government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, unquote. Yet many today, for a variety of reasons, have taken the obvious violations of that original statement of principle in the Declaration as a reason to dispute our country's honorable origins, some to the point of implying we should never have broken from the British Empire. Another large cohort of our citizens continues to pledge loyalty to our Declaration, but interpret it in ways contrary to its spirit and principle. They adhere to a libertarian view that violates the foundation of our liberty which relies on our cooperation as a people for the general welfare and rights of all. They seek freedom from government rather than freedom to use government's power in order to pursue the common good. These shortcomings in understanding our founding principles represent the real crisis for our republic, in my view. It's time to delve in depth into the principles that inspired our forefathers to reject being subjects and undertake to become responsible citizens of a republic. That is the purpose of this book. In other words, what does it mean to go from being a subject to being a citizen? Now, the book came together from two motivations. One was that I have been actively involved, of course, for many decades in trying to rescue the core principles of the American Revolution, starting with economics, but inclusive of the other aspects of a republic. And this is coming to a head again with the upcoming 250th celebrations of the founding of the official founding of the United States with the Declaration of Independence. The second thing that came together was that when facing the idea of writing a new book, I thought, I have a lot of stuff, a lot of articles on my blog that are really worth saving, in a more permanent form. And if I have enough that address the issues of the Republic's foundation, then that would be a way that I could pull together something comprehensive and thought-provoking for this particular occasion. So that is what I did. And it is in 4 sections. Revolutionary Fervor Grows, a preface, which you heard some of. Revolutionary Fervor Grows, number 1. The Declaration, number 2. The Constitution, number 3. And the Challenge, number 4. Now, before starting, let me give you an idea that of one background concept which is necessary to accept first, which is that you should not confuse the revolution with the Revolutionary War. The war is one thing. The actual revolution involves much more in terms of the ideas of the population and how they are going to be committed to governing themselves. So there were 2 statesmen from the time who went out of their way to emphasize this, because people after the war were, writing books. This is my take on what really happened in the war, and so forth. And they didn't want people to make that confusion. John Adams took it from the standpoint that the revolution was effected in the minds of the people before a shot was fired. His quote is a total change of the opinions and affections of the people and a full confidence in the practicability of a union of the colonies occurred between 1761 and 1775, when we had the shooting at Lexington and Concord. Now, you can certainly argue with that in terms of the idea of the full confidence in the union of the colonies, but he has a point in terms of the shift in cultural and mental orientation, which has to be taken seriously. The other person who did this was Benjamin Rush, whom I don't know how familiar you are with. He was a founding father who was stuck in on the Continental Congress at the last minute um, before the Declaration. He was in Philadelphia. A physician, was the head of the medical care for a while, abolitionist, etc. So he, in 1787, right before the Constitutional Convention, wrote the following, an address to the American people. There is nothing more common than to confound the terms of the American Revolution with those of the late American War. Nothing but the first act of the great drama is closed. It remains yet to establish and perfect our new forms of government, and to prepare the principles, morals, and manners of our citizens for these forms of government after they are established and brought to perfection. So his view is what I guess people would call today the continuing revolution, that it's not completed yet. And that he has a point there. He has a point that this is a process of accustoming the habits of government to a new idea of what government should actually be devoted to. So with that in mind, let's go to number section. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some of the highlights of these sections, many of which are elaborated in posts on my blog and therefore incorporated in the book. The book has 22 different blog items. There are about 5 or 6 that are extensive on questions of philosophy and, like, for example, how influential was Locke really, and things like that. And many of the others are short and polemical, which encounter certain myths about the American Revolution. But I'm not going to identify all those things because I hope you'll buy the book, $15. So here we go. Now, of course, from the founding charters of the colonization by British of the American continent, there was relative lack of conflict, but areas of simmering discontent on this side of the Atlantic. And those tended to intensify over time, particularly they intensified in the middle of the 1700s. Those areas were currency and credit, because under the colonial system, the imperial system, that was strictly, that was to be, the British wanted to control that. And when the Americans devised their own means of credit to be able to build their economy, they would be sometimes tolerated and sometimes clamped down on, to their great unhappiness. So the second was their ability to manufacture, and those prohibitions tended to happen in the 1730s, 1750s. This is the Iron Act, this is the Hat Act, and other things of those sorts. The third is trade restrictions, and that, according to pro-British and pro-American historians alike, was considered pretty laxly enforced the Navigation Acts, which restricted and insisted that Americans go through Great Britain for much of their trade, but that became increasingly an area of conflict. And then the area of slavery, because as early as the 17 teens, uh, the legislature of Pennsylvania was trying to stamp out the slave trade with major tax enforcement, but that was vetoed by the Crown. So you got them. They tried 3 times. So it's that was a simmering area of conflict as well. So the what we have. Wait a minute. Okay, folks. The big turning point comes with the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. This is when a couple things happen on the part of the Americans. Number one, they get a much better sense of their own power because they play a major role in the British victory. And number two, they come in contact with uh, the British Army in such a way as to exacerbate the animosity, because the British disregarded a lot of what they had to say. They were very disdainful. And actually, they went back and told uh, King George and others that, we've really let these guys get away with murder. So we've got to clamp down. We either do that now, or, we're not going to be able to control them. George becomes king in the middle of that war, 1760, and he is and that is in the course of that shift in British attitude. And from the beginning, from what I've read so far, and it's by no means everything, and you guys may know more, his attitude was, it's time to assert control. We can't let this thing continue with these Americans thinking that they have all the freedom to determine their own policies. And so they pass a series of acts which exacerbate the conflict. One of them, just one of them, is the Quartering Act of 1765. Now, this, according to what some people say, it said that Americans had to pay for the housing and sustenance of the British troops. And the British troops that were sent, they sent 10,000 British troops. That's more than they sent during the French and Indian War. They were supposedly to shut off the border, which was another act that was shut off the border at the Appalachians, so the Americans wouldn't settle across the mountains. That was seen as it was put forward as today in history books as a pro-Indian move, a liberal move. I don't think it was anything of the sort, but it was intended to restrict growth in the of the American colonies, whom they thought were getting too big for their britches. So So there were a massive number of troops here. Some of them were on that border, others were in cities like New York City. Uh, and they were creating all kinds of problems. The In fact, one of the first inspirations for one of the leading early founding fathers, John Dickinson, was the fact that New York City refused to pay up the money to house the troops, and Britain shut down their legislature or city council um, because they had disobeyed the law. So the tensions were growing at that point. And the other way in which they were growing, which you may be more familiar with, is the clampdown on shipping, so-called smuggling, which sometimes was smuggling and sometimes was not. Um, this was a major confrontation that happened about that off Rhode Island. It's called the Gaspé Affair. That was the name of the British customs schooner that was going after an American ship, and the Rhode Islanders directed the Gaspé uh, into a shoal so they couldn't move, and then they took the troops off and burned it. And this was a major inspiration, actually, for the founding of the Committees of Correspondence in the United States, because the British were so freaked out by the fact this happened, and they couldn't get anybody to talk. Not for decades did anyone say anything about who was there, even though there were 50 leading citizens that were involved in this. Uh, the they said that they were, when they caught somebody, they were taking them to England and trying them for treason. So the word went out, that we in the other colonies have got to be informed about what's going on here. If they can do that, if they can send people for trial in off to England, where their chances of being acquitted are nil, then it can happen anywhere. Major development. This is followed soon after by the Stamp Act, and keep in mind that the Stamp Act is played as a resistance just against an additional tax, and one that was not countenanced by our local uh, uh, institutions of government. Now that's true. There was no taxation without representation, but it's not true that the tax was necessary for the British to pay for the war. What they were using this tax for was to pay for the troops that they had deployed to America, to pay for the judges and the governors whom they wanted to pay, as opposed to the legislatures. The legislatures wanted to continue to pay their public officials because then they had some say over what they were going to do. But So it's not quite what it seemed. And what were they thinking, right? What were they reading about? This I'm going to be very condensed. I'm really talking on too long. So there are 5 elements that Bernard Bailyn, who's the major chronicler of what people were reading in the papers and books and so forth at the time, classical Roman and Greek history, Enlightenment thinkers, and those went the range, what's considered Enlightenment from Locke to Emmerich Vattel, English common law, Puritan thought, including the Bible, most importantly, I think, and radical Whigs in Britain. Now, the radical Whigs are really interesting when it comes to looking at their arguments. And I'm just going to give you a taste of this because they probably were the most cited in this period. And they arose at the conclusion of the South Sea Bubble, which caused a major economic distress in England. That was 1720. And their argument was they weren't anti-monarchy, but their argument was if the king violates his responsibility to act in favor of the public good, then he's violating the rights of Englishmen, and he is not acting legitimately, right? He's effectively forfeiting his crown if he governs by his own will as opposed to the good of the people. Now, of course, these rights of Englishmen were not actually enforced, but this is the idea that they had that should be enforced, that these were their rights, even if they were not getting them. And that was echoed on this side of the Atlantic as well. The one example that I chose was Reverend Jonathan Mayhew of New England, 1750. He gave a 1750 speech published all over the place, praising the decapitation of Charles I. And he took on the so-called religious argument of St. Paul that you had to follow the government you had was installed by God and you had to obey it. So he said, that's not at all what Paul means. He said, Paul makes it clear that if that government is not acting for the good of the people, then he's not a true representative of God. He's not a true representative who should be in power. So forget about slaves having to be obedient to abusive masters, etc., etc. Interesting. So, and eventually we get to the jump to rejecting the monarchy, a claim by Thomas Paine, and the connection made to needing to free the enslaved, which was made, which I've discussed before with you guys in the previous book. Okay, so the Declaration. That's the longest section, by the way. Declaration the marriage certificate after you've already completed all the preparations and commitments to live together. It was the official act, and clearly it was extremely important. But in 1775, already following the 1774 Continental Congress, already in the fall of 1774, parallel government structures were being set up. Every state began to have new constitutions. They stopped putting their taxes into the crown's coffers. They enforced the boycotts and non-consumption. They promoted their own manufactures and so forth. So by the time of of July 1776, you really did have what you would classically call a dual power situation, but you had not had a actual declaration of that independence. These are some of them. Now, there's a major article in the book on the Continental Association, which I highly recommend to you. It emphasizes not just the things that you know about the non-importation, uh, establishing committees of inspection and observation to enforce those, isolation of enemies, and so forth. But the but Section 8 has sets standards of, quote, frugality, economy, and industry, unquote. And it's a major, cultural assault against the against what they considered dissipation and extravagance, which of course was involved buying a lot of stuff from England. But the it was a major attempt to go back to what they considered to be Republican virtue. Republican virtue meaning commitment uh, to the common good, not to enriching yourself. Um, it's a very interesting thing. Gosh, what am I doing here? Okay. Now, the declaration was necessary, and there's a slug on that. It was necessary because if the Americans didn't have the nerve to declare independence, how are you going to expect any country in Europe to recognize and support the war? So it was a strategic necessity, and they did, they took time. They you know, 2, 3 weeks were given to go and uh, poll the population, sometimes change the local assembly, and so forth to get the votes to be able to pass the declaration. It was not a slam dunk by any means. And, that declaration, well, not the declaration, but the slave trade had been stopped with the Continental Association in 1774, and it continued to be stopped throughout the war. Yet it was omitted in the Declaration. I think we've discussed this before, but I have something which I think is new to this group, which is that, many people say it was not, they weren't serious. They were just grandstanding to say rights of, that they were interested in equal rights. But in 1861, the vice president of the Confederacy actually gave a major speech on the superiority of their Constitution to that of the American Constitution. And that article is in the book also, saying that people at the time did believe that enslavement of the African violated the laws of nature. It was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically, but they didn't want to lose the money and the power. However, he said, we are enlightened and we know that it's in the law of nature that these people are inferior and they should continue to be slaves, and it's very good for them to have that honor. So, interesting testimony on the part of someone from the Deep South who looking at that. Lincoln, of course, said what I believe to be true, which was that it was a statement of uh, right. Uh, they set out to declare the right to uh, equal rights, but they wanted that to be there as a maxim, a goal, a standard which should be enforced as soon as it's possible. But, and this is another interesting element in this book, the Declaration was not libertarian. It was not life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness was not intended to be the individual in separation from the society as a whole. And this is a very interesting book written by a woman named Danielle Allen, called Our Declaration. And she takes it from what you might consider a sort of semantic uh, uh, oddity, which is that the second sentence of the Declaration is usually written, and was from early on, it's usually written to say, let me see if I get that. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, period. However, in the original version, there was no period. There was a semicolon and a dash. And it following that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, semicolon, dash, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive, it's the right of the people to alter it. And institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such a form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So what she argues is that the point from the beginning was that you couldn't separate the well-being and rights of the individual from what was necessary for the safety and happiness of the society as a whole. And she, I think, makes a significant argument to that effect, although it's sometimes a bit tedious, um, uh, including through how many people were involved in actually passing some of this legislation, the amount of debate that was involved and so forth. So very worthwhile and a problem I think we have to deal with. And then, of course, the states do begin with uh, a whole lot of liberal, what you would call anti-imperial actions in the wake of the Declaration. These are some of the ones on slavery we've gone through before, the passage of the outlawing of slavery in various of the states, but also loosening restrictions on voting, although property restrictions don't go out of, are not totally eliminated until 1851. Virginia is the last state to eliminate property restrictions for voting. So Now, the Constitution. We obviously have a big question mark over the 1780s as to, now that we've won the war, what happens to this revolution? How is it preserved? How is it continued? And so forth. There's a lot of argument in the present day. It's been for many decades that the Constitution was a counter-revolution. I obviously disagree with that. I believe that, as Hamilton said in the Federalist Papers and many others as well, that the Constitution was to preserve what was won in the Revolutionary War and our freedoms. And the but and to ensure a republic. Now, then you get into, well, what is a republic? And on that, I suppose we could talk for about 6 hours. But the my definition is as follows. I say we were established as a democratic republic, quote unquote, a form of government in which the public good, res publica, is a primary concern of the government, and the citizens see themselves, or actually the primary concern of the government, and the citizens see their own individual welfare as consonant with the welfare of the state, and use their freedoms to ensure that such an outcome occurs. The rights of the individual are intimately connected with his obligations to use his God-given reason to cultivate virtue and the welfare of his fellow citizens. Indeed, pursuing the public good is the key to happiness, both for the individual and the state. So that's my own view. I don't have any particular source for that. It's probably informed by everything from Cicero on, but I think it coheres with the kind of balancing that the best founding fathers attempted to do. Now, it's important to understand that the immediate instigation for the convention was actually the need for economic cooperation between the states. It wasn't the Shays' Rebellion, although that was obviously important, but the fact that they couldn't get, Washington couldn't get Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania to all come together to cooperate on developing the Potomac River. But, it could apply to many other places in terms of the necessity for economic improvements. This is what was necessary. When they called it, Hamilton wrote the call, and it came out of a failed convention on the economic cooperation, the Annapolis Convention. Every state appointed delegates except Rhode Island. They were too busy dealing with their own problems and were disdainful of the center. And it's important to realize that the way that the Constitutional Convention was then established was different from the Continental Congress. All the Continental Congress did was send it on to the states. The states organize special elections uh, to outside the normal legislative process to establish our fundamental law, which is above particular governments and laws. As I think Frederick Douglass said, what the Constitution says and what the government does are not necessarily the same thing, and nor do they invalidate each other. Well, at least the the Constitution shouldn't be invalidated by what the particular governments do. It was ratified directly by the people, but it's not doesn't reflect a government that is the will of the people. So the higher purpose in the preamble, um, I did a little experiment at a book fair I went to a few weeks ago, and I told people they could get a free book if they could recite the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. Um, and my husband said that no one would be able to do it, and he was right. Um, two women came very close, so I gave them a $5 discount. But and people used to memorize these things. I came across two people who had once been taught to memorize it, but they don't take it seriously. But this is the serious commitment of the Constitution of the United States. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States. Now, there are numerous things that are interesting about this. I'm not going to go in them in detail. But the other distressing thing, in my view, was that one woman told me, well, when she talks about this to young people today, they say, well, you can't have that general welfare thing in there. We're not in favor of welfare. So that was, of course, the general welfare is the only phrase, a goal that is in both. It is in twice in the U.S. Constitution. It's in the preamble, and it's in the powers of Congress, Section 1, number 8. And there's a distinct difference between the Confederation Agreement, which was made in 1781, and the Constitution in a number of respects. General welfare is in both. General welfare is in both. The posterity was not in the Confederation, and the Confederation called for, quote, a firm league of friendship, not a perfect union, a more perfect union. So that is also gives you a picture of the difference there. Now, there was very broad involvement in ratification of the U.S. Constitution. There were 5 or 6 states in which actually proper, Black men who met the property qualifications could vote, by the way. But it varied a lot as to how many representatives they decided to have at these conventions. Massachusetts had the most. They had 370 delegates. Of course, they're the home of the town meeting, right? Virginia had 170, Pennsylvania 69, New York 65, and some of them much less representative. But there were newspaper articles, there was Federalist papers, but not just pro-Constitution, anti-Constitution papers. It was debated high and low all over the nation, and made it in terms of, you could say it made it only because of a compromise, but it made it as the fundamental law of the nation. Now, I also go through in the main article in this last section the Republican features that are in the Constitution, which militate against this counter-revolution idea and contrast heartily with governments in the rest of the world at the time. One being no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office or profit or trust shall, without the consent of Congress, accept of any present emolument, office, or title of any kind from any king, prince, or foreign state. States also weren't allowed to do that. Article 4, Section 4 guarantees a republican form of government to every state. So you can't have a dictator take over one state without violating the Constitution. No property or religious qualification for office. I tend to think that's fairly radical, but I haven't explored it in other countries. But the fact, and now in the States, there were some religious tests. There were attempts to keep out Catholics. Actually, that was defeated in New York. But no property qualification, no religious qualification, just an age qualification and a citizenship qualification. Right to a jury trial. The trial of all crimes except in cases of impeachment shall be by jury. The trial shall be held in the state where the crime shall have been committed, and when not committed within any state, shall be at the place Congress directs. And as far as the slavery question is concerned, I know I've discussed this before, but I included in the book what Frederick Douglass said. I deny that the Constitution guarantees the right to hold property in man, and believe that the way to abolish slavery in America is to vote such men into office that will use their powers for the abolition of slavery. And then you have the powers over the economy, which by the Congress, which is another aspect of Republican government. I'm not going to go through those. And you have George Washington's farewell address, where he outlines the requirements for a successful republic, emphasizing above all both the need for national unity. His argument against faction is very much related to the sectional divide, but also ensuring economic cooperation to the mutual benefit. And then he also uh, says, virtue on the part of the citizen is required, and education, education, institutions of knowledge in order to ensure that our people are qualified to be Republican citizens. Now, just quickly, the last section of this book is, oh, wait a minute. The overall, there's another broader concept which should be noted from Washington's farewell address: reason over passion, reason over passion, and union over faction. And these require, he says, morality and education. Now, the last section was a late thought, but I thought critical. It involves one full speech of Abraham Lincoln and one partial quotations from Frederick Douglass. The Lincoln one, which I don't know whether I've discussed on here before, was given in 1838. It was called "On the Perpetuation of Our Institutions." It was given in the wake of the murder of Elijah Lovejoy, the abolitionist in Missouri. But that was not the only kind of mob action happening at the time. It was up and down the country, which Lincoln says, this is not in the slaves, just in the slave states, not just in the anti-slave states. It's, this is a national phenomenon of mob, people taking the law into their own hands and ignoring the law. So this speech is usually summarized with the quote, "At what point is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its lot and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide." So but that doesn't at all capture the depth of this document. And if you want me to go through it more, I can in discussion, but it goes methodically, step by step, what considerations there are for what happens when you have a culture that is increasingly dominated by mob action, and concludes that you have to have education and respect for the law. You have to have that. The Frederick Douglass also hits on education. You may be aware that one of the most popular articles on my blog, which is what this is, was inspired by a meeting about integrating the schools in Loudoun County. But the quote that I led that with is, "True knowledge unfits a man to be a slave." Now later in another address, which was primarily to fellow Black Americans, he also said, "It is idle, a hollow mockery for us to pray to God to break the oppressor's power while we neglect the means of knowledge which will give us the ability to break this power. God will help us when we help ourselves. Now, I mean, people could misuse that quote, but the point is educate yourself, think, read, uh, and uh, and consider nothing off limits. And only if you have a thinking citizen are you going to have a lasting republic. And that, my friends, I think is, well, I'm going to end, and I'm very sorry about this problem with the email, but I mean, but
No,
hopefully,
the direct mind to mind engagement was good. It forced us to use our imaginations a lot more, so that's good.
yeah,
Um,
I remember that with reading to my kids. You know, they were much more involved if I read them Kidnapped than if they had seen it on TV, you know. Anyway, sorry.
this is a good healthy bedtime story for adults, I guess, or wake up story. Actually, I guess is more like it. Because yeah, there's definitely a lot of core lessons, and I guess before I go to the questions, people are waiting to throw you some thoughts and questions. For there's a lot of patriots today who identify on the right or on the left, but who all are uh, who all would like to see the republic survive and become good again. But despite that patriotism, there obviously a lot of the lessons that you went through today are sorely lacking. So, just quickly, concretely, what sort of strategic advice would you give to patriots who want to figure out how do they save their country? What would you just tell them they are not doing enough of or need to do more of in order to be effective? Because right now, it's not really working when most people are thinking about their relationship to their country.
Well, I mean, I can't. I mean, I'm not going to tell everybody to, you know, hole up in a camp and read for 3 months, right? But the uh, but I think that study of our of the I mean, every single issue that we face today was faced from the beginning of the republic. You mean clearly, and therefore, I think that one of the major things that people should be doing is studying and learning about the republic, and that they have to fit that into their schedule, right? They have to make it a must, you know, that it's not uh something of when I have time, right? You know, when, you know, X happens, or, you know, when uh, uh, because people have to start thinking about, they have to start not just reacting emotionally, they have to start thinking. That's what these people are saying over and over again. I mean, we know that a lot of the founding fathers had tremendous emotional reactions to all sorts of things, but they controlled themselves by forcing themselves to to read, study, and think. And it drives me mad when people say, "But people don't read today." And so I say, you know, well, if they're not going to read, we're not going to make it. You know,
Yeah.
we're just not going to make it. You know, you can talk about 2 sentence, you know, 2 minute video TikTok things all you want. But with that kind of attention span, it won't happen. I mean,
Yeah.
that's all I can. I mean, for the average person, just fit it in, right? You know, start with the Federalist Papers, or, you know, I would obviously think that starting with my book would be a very good thing to do, because I think it raises a lot of questions. It does. I didn't put all the footnotes in. Those can be found on the
No,
on the.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I mean, you condensed decades and decades of research into very concise handbooks, very, very easy to access for anybody really just seeking to be effective in this world and to accelerate. Like, I mean, reading through your books, you can get the effects of effectively what would otherwise be a multi-year university program condensed in a very efficient way that you could find your own mind. Once you do that, your mind's abilities to think through problems and think through solutions with those lessons that you've delivered will be enhanced. So
I try not to be preachy. I really did.
no, you aren't, and it is a breath of fresh air to read. And you know, think about the amount of time people spend watching sports per week, playing video games, watching binging on some Netflix show or Amazon Prime show, or just scrolling on inane videos on social media. And I've wasted many an hour that I should not have that I cannot get back, getting lost in Twitterland. But
Can
so
you
yeah. Huh?
can you hold up the book, Nancy? Can you hold up the book that you were talking about just now?
Yes.
Thank you.
I mean,
Right,
it does exist in ebook as well. You know, if there's anybody who likes that. But you know, it's $15, and uh, about, as I said, it's in pieces, so it's easy to read. My happiest thing was the first response. I got 3 unsolicited positive responses right at the beginning. Now everything's slowed down, but you know, the that I had never gotten unsolicited, because I always feel as though I have to go out and say, would you buy it? Would you review it? Would you would you get it around, et cetera, because I just I don't have a publicist. I don't have a, you know, and I have much less energy than I had previously. So I think there was someone else there who was.
There's a Monty's been waiting. Monty, go for it.
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy, and very good to meet and see you again. We go back a number of years. I'll start off by recounting that Matthew was often talking about in context of history. There was those moments we had we were able to win over and defeat those powers, oligarchy or otherwise. And a Revolutionary War was one good example of that. And there's other times in history where tragically we could have done something and we didn't do something, and it led to more or less failure and tragedy and what have you. And the Revolutionary War was certainly one of those periods. Second World War, where we defeated the Germans, but the Nazis came out and we didn't clean up that mess. That might be another example. But you mentioned Thomas Paine in the course of this, and I think he was a very significant figure insofar as the success of our Revolutionary War, very prolific writer. There's something of a burr under my saddle for many years, which I've never had adequately addressed. And very concisely, I would like just to present it to you, because I've read a lot of Thomas Paine, and I've always been somewhat stumped by this. As you know, he was in France and imprisoned in France.
Right.
And basically, just like Trump, coming back to the current time, just as Trump could have ended this war in Ukraine as he promised and taken on the deep state and stopped the genocide basically in Palestine, Gaza, basically with a phone call. I mean, he had that power, but for various reasons, reluctant to take on the powers that be. And in particular, I think that power resides in the city of London and the British, the media, the industrial complexes. But for whatever reason, he capitulates, and we have for many years, with the British establishment. In the case of Thomas Paine, while he was in prison, as you know, he wrote The Rights of Man.
Right.
He wrote, and the one that got him in the biggest trouble was The Age of Reason.
Right.
But another thing that got him in trouble is he vehemently opposed the Jay Treaty, which was very controversial.
Right.
And basically, Washington was for this. He negotiated it in secret and kind of got it shoved through the Senate without much negotiation. But one hypothesis of mine is, and it was also Thomas Paine addressed this specifically, is that Washington capitulated. In other words, all it would have taken for Paine to be released was acknowledgement by Washington that Paine was a U.S. citizen. Now, that was Paine's view. And I've never seen this adequately addressed in a historical by scholars. Paine is kind of put aside, and he was kind of a rabble-rouser and just too far out there. But one thing I would note in relationship to your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and the ideas that form the basis for citizens not just being individual, but the common benefit to all in our posterity. One thing that Paine did write about was that each citizen or inhabitant of this land, actually by reason of their birth here, owned a part of that land, a part of that property. And therefore, he was the first to come up with the idea that, we should have pension systems and educational systems through the resources of this land to provide for the benefit of the all, which I thought is quite a remarkable idea, which really hasn't caused fruition, even though there's some semblance of it. I know I've gone on quite a bit, but if you have any comment on this or could direct me to anybody that may have addressed this specifically about Thomas Paine, and what I see as a failure on the part of, as Paine said, as Washington in particular, of not freeing him because of his opposition to the Jay Treaty, and what the implications of that Jay Treaty really was, which further subjugated the United States to British rule. Thank you.
Well, I know that the Jay Treaty was not what Hamilton and Washington wanted. It included a provision, I think the one that had to do with the West Indies in particular, that they really didn't want to concede. But they believed that the alternative was not viable in terms of going to war. I mean, I've read correspondence on the part of Hamilton, not relative to the Jay Treaty per se, but relative to the situation on the frontier, where I think the British asked for the right to for passage through American territory, and they didn't want to give it to them, but Hamilton said, but if we don't give it to them, we're going to be stuck with a military problem, and we can't deal with that military problem. So I think that in terms of the Jay Treaty and whether that was a major capitulation, I am doubtful, because I think that there were considerations as to whether we had any alternative at that time that was viable. I mean, later on, of course, you could say, well, it worked in the War of 1812. We almost got our asses handed to us in the War of 1812. I mean, the only reason that we made it out of the War of 1812 was because the British decided Napoleon was, more important to go after. Uh, we were not prepared for that one for sure. But in terms of what he did with Thomas Paine, I really don't. I really don't have any particular information. I remember reading a long time ago about him being imprisoned. I didn't know that he was imprisoned because of the Jay Treaty. But although I know the French were very upset about the Jay Treaty, uh, so I mean that's all I can say, Monty, because I haven't looked into that period very much. I know, Thomas Paine did some surprising things. Yeah. Uh, he was very much on the Jeffersonian side, but at a certain point in 1790s, he went to Rhode Island to campaign for the National Bank. So was that just because he needed a job, right? And he was a hired pen? I mean, I don't know. I really don't know. But because I haven't devoted a lot of study to him. I did very early on, but that was a long time ago, Monty. The 1970s were a long time ago, and I've turned my attention elsewhere. So, but I don't think that. I think if you have you read the Hamilton defenses of the Jay Treaty?
No, I'm
Try
not
that.
familiar with that. And I didn't mean to infer that Thomas Paine was in prison because of the Jay Treaty. I'm just saying there was active correspondence where he was allowed to languish because in Washington's view and those in favor of the Jay Treaty, they saw him as a threat as far as becoming out and being more outspoken and gathering popular opinion against that.
Nancy,
Well,
I would like to read the Hamilton Defense of the Jay Treaty, and I've never read it. Could you email that to me? Or I guess I
yeah,
could find it. I'll find it, and then I'll include it in the links to this description
yeah,
box
yeah, yeah, yeah,
under this video as well.
yeah,
Something I'd like to dig into.
yeah, right, yeah. He wrote a several part defense of that.
That's interesting.
I think they're the Phocian letters, but I'm not positive.
Okay. I've taken a note, so I'll find it. I'll track them down.
Right.
Cool. Richard Moore.
Yeah, I want a little bit more about Thomas Paine. I was out of the room for a few minutes, and I don't know what you said about him during your lecture, but I've always had the belief that the publication of Common Sense in January of 1776 was pivotal in shifting public opinion to enable the Declaration of Independence to be supported.
Yes.
Am I wrong, or is that something you've looked at?
Oh, well, definitely. I mean, Washington wanted all his troops to read it. He said it has a wonderful effect when the troops read this. For sure, it did. Uh, um, but that doesn't go against the idea that they needed to do it for strategic reasons. And they needed to get enough. They needed to get popular pressure on the legislators who were scared silly about taking on the British Empire. All right, I mean, the more reason, there were obviously ones that were not quite so upstanding, but even upstanding ones, I mean, you could understand people being afraid to take on the world's greatest military power. So I mean, Hamilton was by 1775 convinced we could win, but I don't think that was generally accepted.
Did you have a follow-up question there, Richard?
Well, just a comment is that what I had learned, and I could be totally wrong, is that it wasn't so much whether they thought they could win or not, as to whether they really wanted to be independent rather than just get more rights as British citizens. And that shifting toward, yes, we really do want to be independent, was what I kind of give Thomas Paine credit for with common sense. And it's really, I think common sense is the only really significant political thing that Paine accomplished. He wrote philosophical things later that people talk about, but common sense actually had political effect at the time. And that's enough for me to say.
Well, I wouldn't say that I think it was a very important intervention to for for mass organizing. But I don't think that it was, but I think that it came along with a lot of other progress that was going on without that. I mean, as I said before, I mean, following all these states following the 1774 First Continental Congress, were changing their governments to be independent of the British. They weren't giving them any money. They were setting up their own military. You know, uh, they were setting up their own courts. They were not cooperating with the courts of Great Britain. So it was what's in a name? Well, in a way, everything's in a name, and in a way, nothing. So actually saying that this is what we've done was a huge step, and Paine made it very clear. It also the word spread. I mean, people were saying that the monarch was being misbriefed, right? It's sort of like, well, he was misbriefed, right? He really is for us. But he came out in the summer of 1775 and said, crush them, crush them. I don't want to hear it. I don't read their petitions. I do. I mean, so that was well publicized and well known. So it didn't take it. There were emotional ties to the British monarchy, clearly, and rational ties, it was something else, right? And the rational ties were being stripped away during the course of events with what the king was ordering them to do. So, uh, I, Paine definitely deserves credit for that. He deserves credit for, he very early on did campaigning against slavery. He did a lot of decent things. But and he had a concept of a republic which was pretty good as far as the book that of writings, the political economy of the American Revolution back in 1777, not 1977. The I have I have a document by him, which I quote in terms of what a republic is, which is maybe worth reading. Someone there may have that.
Yeah, I have it here. I'm just looking for it in the table of contents. Um, I got it. I got it here. Um,
I'm pretty sure well, I know I have it here. or maybe it's in the opening essay. It may not be
Oh,
at that.
Thomas, dissertations on government, the affairs of the
Yeah,
bank and paper money, page 302.
right.
Um,
Yes, right.
you want to read it?
No, it's
Okay.
long.
This book, by the way, for people who may not have it, that Nancy just referenced, that she first published in 1977, it's full of essential original material of the people who made the American Revolution happen, centuries even before the American Revolution happened, all the
Right.
way through the founding fathers. And it's an essential resource. I recommend everybody pick up if they can online. So yeah, it's Thomas Paine's distorted reputation as a radical anti-federalist has rested primarily on works such as The Rights of Man and Common Sense. And you go through it, and so you're saying this particular essay that he wrote is his defense of the bank and the Hamiltonian system.
Right.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at it for a long time, but I remember that I did it.
Well, that's interesting.
I think I'm gonna have to close out,
Yeah, for
Matt.
sure.
Uh,
Okay.
so I'm sorry for the screw up, and I'll see you. I better fix it.
Oh, that's fine. And is it okay, Nancy, with you if I give Sue's been waiting to ask a question, so could I give her your email and then have her email you?
Sure. Absolutely. You can give anybody my email.
All right, great.
I'm not, when I get flooded with emails, I'll turn it off, but it hasn't happened yet. And
All right.
please, if I would so appreciate purchases and reviews. If you, I think you'll find it very worthwhile.
All right. So you got that, everybody. That's our homework. Pick up the book, write a review, and share your
And share your news with your American neighbor. No, with
yes.
whoever you know in the United States who you think is acting like a jackass. Okay.
Thank you, Nancy, so much for sharing this wisdom and your research. And thank you, everybody, for sharing this Sunday with us. Take care.
Okay, thank you.